Hearing will come to order. I'd like to welcome today's witness, Mr. Dan Elwell, the Deputy Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration and Acting Administrator from January of 2018 until August of this year. I understand Mr. Elwell left a conference with his international counterparts in Montreal to be with us here today, so I thank you for doing that, for accommodating us. I also want to welcome Mr. Earl Lawrence, who serves as Executive Director of the FAA's Aircraft Certification Service. He's here to assist us with technical questions during the hearing. We appreciate your both being here. The FAA's certification process is a vital component of aviation safety. Located within FAA's Office of Aviation Safety, the Aircraft Certification Service ensures that pilots, aircraft, and aircraft components, as well as airlines and charter flight operators, meet safety standards and regulatory requirements. More than 1,300 engineers, scientists, inspectors, and test pilots are responsible for carrying out these critical activities. Unfortunately, this certification process, long considered the gold standard by other regulators around the world, has been called into question following the tragic crash of Lion Air Flight 610 in Indonesia and the crash of Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 less than 5 months later. These horrible incidents resulted in the deaths of 346 people and caused immeasurable pain and suffering for the victims' families, some of whom are with us in the hearing room today. They don't just deserve our sympathy, however. They deserve a thorough and impartial accounting of what went wrong, followed by the implementation of any reforms, any changes necessary to ensure that something like this can never happen again. As with many aviation disasters, it appears that a complex chain of events occurred in just the right sequence with devastating consequences. Initial reports indicate that equipment failure, automated systems in the cockpit, and human error may all share some of the blame. There are also many legitimate questions surrounding the certification process and the extent to which the certification process has been delegated through Organization Designation Authority, ODA, the arrangement with Boeing, whether that may have contributed to a massive failure in regulatory oversight. I want to be clear, as members of Congress, we are not professional accident investigators or prosecutors. We, in fact, await the release of the crash reports from experts on the ground and the pending recommendations from several investigative panels that are expected in the coming weeks and months. At the same time, as elected officials, we're charged with independently assessing what has happened and using our own judgment to consider possible remedies. We will work with the FAA, the many oversight bodies conducting audits and reviews, and outside experts to ensure that profits and production timelines are never prioritized over the safety of the traveling public. This subcommittee in particular is responsible for allocating resources to the FAA so the agency can effectively carry out its mission. This isn't a partisan issue. Under the leadership of both Democratic and Republican members, we have consistently funded FAA's aviation safety and certification activities at or above the levels requested by the agency. In the wake of the MAX crashes, the House passed fiscal 2020 THUD funding bill. Our bill included a major infusion of new funding in anticipation of substantive responses required by the ongoing reviews. We need a detailed and transparent accounting from the FAA about what happened, how the agency is using existing resources, and whether additional funding or additional authorities are needed for FAA to remain the world leader in aviation safety. For example, how do we ensure that FAA employees and their designated representatives working for aircraft manufacturers are insulated, totally insulated, from conflicts of interest? Does the FAA have adequate in-house expertise and staff with proficiency in computer science, systems and engineering, and data modeling? How will FAA safely return the MAX to service in coordination with international partners? We also need more details as to how the FAA plans to review, assess, and expeditiously implement any forthcoming recommendations. The confidence in our aviation system is at stake, and nothing less than full disclosure and accountability from all stakeholders is going to be required. The strength of the Appropriations Committee lies in our commitment to comprehensive oversight of agency funding and activities, line by line, year by year. This hearing is just an initial step in this process. I expect the FAA to continue to provide us with timely information to inform our work, and I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witness today. Now I'd like to recognize the distinguished ranking member, my friend and partner, Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, sir, and thank you for holding this very important hearing on the Federal Aviation Administration certification activities and other issues. And I will start by really associating myself with the words of the chairman. I also want to thank our witnesses, and we had a very productive meeting before, and so we have again the FAA's Deputy Administrator, who also recently served as acting FAA administrator. I do want to note, sir, your experience as an Air Force trained fighter pilot, and who served in the first Gulf War prior to flying for the commercial airlines. And so, on a separate note, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. Look, Chairman Price and I have worked for over 4 years, very closely now, to make aviation safety a top priority within the THUD bill. In particular, we have worked together to make sure that the FAA's Aviation Safety Office has the resources it needs to certify aircraft, to oversee safety of the safety of air carriers, and ensure that pilots and the rest of the aviation workforce operate within, again, with the highest standard for public safety. That always has to be, obviously, the first priority. These investments have contributed to the U.S. leading the way to a historic record of safety in commercial aviation in recent years. However, these two crashes of the Boeing 737 MAX, both the Lion Air and Ethiopian, again, claimed 346 lives. And it stunned the global aviation community. It stunned the American people and clearly has pained all of us. And so, again, as I mentioned before, I associate my words with what the chairman said. To all those that lost loved ones in these flights, there are no words to express what needs to be expressed. But you see, I see it as our duty on this committee to play our part to ensure that such a tragedy never happens again. The Boeing 737 MAX was certified by the FAA through a process known as Organization Delegation Authority, as we refer to it as ODA. And Congress has supported this ODA process and other forms of delegation for decades. It's not a new issue. And I also understand, and I've gotten more information about that delegation is the practice not only of the FAA, but frankly of many aviation authorities around the world. And I look forward to discussing the ODA process in this hearing this afternoon, but I would be remiss because there have recently been questions raised about the qualifications of the FAA safety workforce, particularly those who participate in flight standardization boards. We need to be assured that the FAA has the right level of oversight when it delegates certification activities, and we need assurances that the FAA safety personnel have the right credentials to do their jobs, because obviously the safety of our skies cannot be compromised. I look forward to hearing what the FAA is doing to restore the global confidence in the certification process and what practical steps we can take to help you achieve that goal. And finally, I do have a specific request, if at all possible, at the beginning, which is to make this conversation more productive and to make sure that we're all on the same page and all understanding what we're saying. There are a lot of acronyms out there, and I would ask you if you could please try to not use acronyms and to actually, I know it's going to be a little bit longer, but spell out the words, because otherwise it's a whole separate language, right, different language. And so that, Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you for holding what I believe is a very, very important meeting, and I thank you for your leadership. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the ranking member of the chairwoman of the full committee, the House Appropriations Committee, Representative Nita Lowey.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Price, Ranking Member Diaz-Balart, for holding this hearing. I welcome Deputy Administrator Elwell before the subcommittee. Deputy Administrator Elwell, as we discuss improving the organizational designation authorization process, I trust that you and your colleagues at the FAA share a commitment to ensuring that all passengers, pilots, and crew members can travel safely through our skies. Please use this committee as a resource. We want to help you prevent the next aviation catastrophe. We want to know where federal funding is best directed. I find it troubling that the President's FY 2020 budget request included a $9 million reduction in FAA safety funding. House Democrats responded in our fiscal year 2020 Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill by increasing FAA safety funding $267 million above FY19 enacted levels. Our bill provides the FAA the resources to hire more inspectors, engineers, and technicians to oversee the organization, designation, authorization process, and other safety functions. Secretary Chow has said that her #1 priority at the Department of Transportation is safety. If we're going to address the root causes of the MAX crashes, then we must have a bipartisan commitment to robust funding to promote the safety of our air travelers, both at home and abroad. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to your testimonies. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Administrator. We, again, appreciate your being here. We recognize you for a 5-minute opening statement, and any statement beyond that that you'd like to submit for the record, we would welcome that submission. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Price, Chairwoman Lowy, and Ranking Member Diaz-Balart. It's good to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the FAA certification process, and in particular, what we're doing to re-examine that process following the 737 MAX crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia. Before I go further, I want to recognize the families and friends of those who lost their lives in those crashes. We at the FAA acknowledge your pain and your loss. It reconfirms the seriousness with which we approach safety and solidifies our resolve to make the aviation system as safe as we possibly can. The FAA's aircraft certification processes are well-established, thorough, and have consistently produced safe aircraft designs. Since 1997, FAA and industry efforts have cut the risk of a fatal commercial aviation accident in the United States by 94%. In the past 10 years, there was one commercial airline passenger fatality in the U.S. in over 90 million flights. But one fatality is one too many. That is why our safety culture focuses on continuous improvement and why we welcome external reviews of how we regulate. The FAA certifies the design of aircraft and components used in civil aviation operations. Some version of our certification process has been in place and served us well for over 60 years, but it is under constant review. What has not changed is that for any project, the FAA identifies all safety standards and makes all key decisions regarding certification of the aircraft. To leverage the technical expertise that exists outside of the FAA and to enable FAA's experts to focus on the most critical issues, we allow for delegation, including organization designation authorization, or ODA, as you've mentioned. With ODA, the FAA may authorize an organization to act as its representative. Such delegation is not self-certification. The FAA retains strict oversight authority. It is the applicant's responsibility to ensure that the aircraft complies with FAA safety regulations. The FAA's responsibility is to set the safety standards and determine that the applicant has shown that the overall design meets the standards. While these certification processes have helped us to build an admirable safety record, the 737 MAX crashes placed a spotlight on FAA's approach to aircraft certification. There are a variety of reviews of our processes and procedures underway, all of which we welcome. At the request of Secretary Chow, the Department of Transportation's Inspector General is auditing the certification of the 737 MAX, and a new 22-member committee will advise the Department on aviation safety oversight and certification programs, including a review of the FAA's procedures for the certification of new aircraft. The FAA established a Joint Authorities Technical Review, or JATR, to review the certification of the 737 MAX automated flight control system. The JATR is chaired by former NTSB Chairman Christopher Hart. We anticipate reviewing the JATR's report soon. These initiatives, the IG audit, the advisory committee, and the JATR, are geared toward developing systemic improvements for the future. Other efforts have focused more specifically on safely returning the MAX to service. The FAA initiated a multi-agency independent technical advisory board, or TAB, to review Boeing software update and system safety assessment. The TAB is evaluating Boeing's proposed technical solutions for the 737 MAX, and the TAB's recommendations will inform the FAA's decision concerning the 737 MAX fleet's return to service. In keeping with the FAA's long-standing cooperation with its international partners, the FAA hosted MAX-focused meetings of directors general of civil aviation authorities from around the world in May, and again, as the chairman just mentioned, 3 days ago in Montreal. We also met in April with safety representatives and pilot unions for the 3 U.S.-based commercial airlines that have the Boeing 737 MAX in their fleets. Finally, our new administrator, Steve Dixon, like me, is an experienced pilot who is using his background to understand the MAX's problems and propose solutions. Steve took part, as I did, in simulator sessions and is planning to pilot an actual MAX aircraft during FAA's review of Boeing's proposed fix. At this time, we continue to evaluate Boeing software modification, and we are still developing necessary training requirements. This work is not following any prescribed timeline. As we've said repeatedly, the MAX will return to service for U.S. carriers in the U.S. airspace, and it won't be returned until the FAA's analysis of the facts and technical data indicate that it is safe to do so. This concludes my statement.
Thank you. The focus of this hearing is on how the FAA exercises its certification authority, the degree to which the agency delegates that authority, carries it out itself, and then delegates authority, and the way the FAA oversees the process of delegation, the work done by the delegated authority, and of course then the budgetary implications, the staffing and expertise and budgetary implications of all of this. What does it take to do this and do it well and do it with the assurance we need that these processes are being expertly and thoroughly carried out, and that you have the resources, the personnel you need to do this, that you can hire and retain the kind of expertise the agency simply must have to carry out both the in-house functions and also to oversee the delegated functions. Presumably, this review process may lead to some reassessment of how much you've delegated. What kind of capacity remains in-house at the FAA, and to the extent you conclude that delegation is acceptable and necessary, then what does it take to make sure that that is overseen properly, and that to the extent industry is involved in this, that there is not a chance of profits being placed over safety, not a chance of conflicts of interests intervening, that we absolutely are assured of the integrity of this process. Now, whatever form this takes in the end, and we understand you cannot anticipate all this now because these reports are coming and we'll all need to scrutinize what those reports recommend. Still, we have to write a budget for next year. You have to draw some conclusions right now about what this experience indicates and the direction you want to go. And the first line of questioning, therefore, needs to be for this hearing anyway, needs to be what the agency needs going forward to assure us all, assure the flying public that safety is being placed, has a primary focus, and that you can carry out your functions. So, the capacity of the workforce, the size, the skill, the culture is going to shape everything you do. You're under a lot of pressure to improve efficiency, to reduce costs. The industry is under those pressures. So achieving efficiency and reducing costs, is going to continue to require changes in flight operations, changes in technology. This is going to introduce more and more complexity into the certification process. So, bottom line question, do you have enough computer scientists, systems engineers, human factor scientists, data analytics professionals who are as fluent in the state-of-the-art as their industry counterparts and as fluent as they need to be?
Thank you for that question, Chairman Price. You were correct in your opening statement in saying that this committee has always adequately funded the FAA for its mandate and for its duties. I just reiterate, safety is absolutely, as Secretary Chow has said, as all of you have said, is our #1 priority. And that, to that end, is what we look at when we're determining our workforce. Right now, we have an adequate workforce for what you described, but it's interesting that you put it the way you did, sir, about keeping pace with technological advancement. That is a challenge. Technology is changing much more rapidly today than when I entered the business 30, 40 years ago. And it is a challenge to keep pace with industry technology changes. So we're looking for system safety engineers. We're looking for computer programming experts. But of course, we're competing with the panoply of industries that require those same skills. And we're competing for a dwindling supply of STEM graduates coming out of universities around the world. So we appreciate you asking that question. We are adequately funded and staffed today. But as you said, these reports will no doubt give us more insight into our processes and our needs and our particularly resource needs. And I commit to you to continue a dialogue with this committee and you on what our resource needs are going forward.
We need to have that dialogue, and it needs to be kept absolutely current. We will produce a budget for next year, and it'll make certain assumptions about what your needs are. And I stress again, this is not a static picture. We need to assess what has happened here. By definition, this has been a regulatory failure. And we have to understand it thoroughly and understand to what extent what its implications are for the delegation authority, for the in-house performance of FAA, and for what it's going to take to perform these functions going forward. So we of course, in the near term, we'll need to make these adjustments and do the best we can to address these needs for the next fiscal year. But this is going to be an ongoing challenge. And at the root, this process and whether it works is about the people you hire, their integrity, their expertise, and the effectiveness of how they're organized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elwell, September 23rd, Office of Special Counsel letter raised some serious questions about aviation safety inspector training weaknesses that were also identified by an internal FAA investigation, is my understanding. So both investigations found that safety inspectors in Long Beach and Seattle did not meet FAA's formal training requirements. Now, this resulted in the FAA inspector lacking proper credentials to establish pilot requirements for the Gulfstream 7. Obviously, at best, this would suggest either a lack of clarity in training requirements for safety inspectors, or at worst, well, something worse. You know, this could raise serious safety concerns. So, can you assure us that you have taken all the necessary steps to correct this deficiency? And if it isn't a deficiency, you might want to clarify that in pilot standards for the Gulfstream 7.
Thank you, Mr. Ballart, Diaz-Balart. That is still being discussed internally, but what I can tell you today is any insinuation that the FAA misled Chairman Wicker and in our reply to his inquiry is not what happened. I want to make clear also that the OSC's letter connecting training ambiguity, as you alluded to the MAX is also simply not accurate. The training issue identified by FAA's independent auditor was not related to the specific work of the 737 MAX Flight Standardization Board members. And the FAA representatives on the Flight Standardization Board were fully qualified for the activities they performed. That said, the original whistleblower allegation did raise legitimate issues. We are dealing with those issues. As you mentioned, the Gulfstream 7. We are looking intently at the ambiguity in the original order that led to some of the confusion. But I can assure you there was no misleading in the letter sent to the senator, and absolutely no pilots working on the 737 MAX certification were unqualified. They were all fully qualified for their activities.
But I get that. I mean, I did read those letters, but on the, let's talk, which is why I'm kind of focusing on the Gulfstream 7. I mean, there seem to be some issues, right? Am I wrong?
That was the original whistleblower charges were against the Gulfstream 7 pilots,
Right.
but
So what steps are you taking to correct this flaw in inspector training requirements, or you know, what else can you tell us that will restore our confidence in the competence of inspectors involved in again, flight standardization boards?
So the first thing I should do is separate the difference between what you're talking about, the Gulfstream 7. Those are check pilots. That is a completely different training regimen and product in the pilot supply that we use for Flight Standardization Board. So there was some ambiguity in the training instructions for the Gulfstream 7. That ambiguity led to the perception that some of them had not gone through all of the training procedures. That ambiguity is what we're looking at, what we're focused on, and what we're determined to remove. We shouldn't have that kind of ambiguity in our orders. We absolutely respect the OSC's role in what they're doing. We have issue with some of the things that they've concluded in their investigation, but we are going to rectify this, particularly to your point, the Gulfstream 7 check airman training issue.
That would be helpful. Mr. Chairman, I want to go into the whole international certification process, what other countries do, but I don't have enough time, so I'll wait for the next round if that's all right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Lowy.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I was detained in another hearing and I couldn't hear the whole presentation. But I'm a little puzzled by what I'm hearing. Lives were lost. Families will never regain their loved ones. And there seems to be ambiguity that maybe you can clarify as to what's your responsibility, what's Boeing's responsibility. And then you were talking about it's difficult to find youngsters who graduate, I hear this all the time, who graduate without the appropriate credentials and focus on the expertise that you need. What are you doing about it? It'd be nice if maybe we provided more scholarships. But to me, that's such a weak excuse for a company like Boeing that is making, I won't even getting into the numbers. I'm just puzzled by some of the testimony as to whose responsibility is it. For example, reports indicate that in the case of the 737 MAX, not all of the pilots flying the aircraft were alerted to key changes in the software governing the response to runaway trim. Do you see it as the FAA's responsibility to notify pilots of relevant changes, the technical changes? Or is that a task best delegated to your private sector partners? This to me is really shocking. I would think it's the responsibility of Boeing, but if you're not doing appropriate oversight, maybe you're the culprit as well. Could you discuss that? This is very puzzling to me.
Chairwoman Lowy, you started with the question about workforce. So just for a moment, I'll talk about that. Workforce and the future workforce of the FAA is a very high priority for us. We have a future workforce steering group. We're looking at working with industry, working with universities, working with trade schools, working with associations that reach out to young people to get young people. We're finding it's too late to talk to young people about aerospace technical degrees. We have to, in high school, we have to get them in elementary school, and so we have a lot of programs. It's a concern, but it's a future workforce thing. As I said to Chairman Price, we are adequately staffed today, but we are looking to the future. With regard to the certification of the MAX, those are excellent questions. As I said in my open remarks, the responsibility to meet the certification standards rests with the manufacturer. And then it's the FAA's responsibility to ensure that the certification process and the way in which the manufacturer meets those standards is adequate, and we check it all along the way. There is no self-certification. You mentioned about training. Part of certification, the certification application that the manufacturer of the aircraft puts forward is their recommended training protocol. And that also we oversee and we have to approve. So clearly, as the chairman mentioned, there are issues that have led to these horrific crashes. We are addressing and working. I think there were, and Earl, you can get into the finer details. Over 100,000 hours from the FAA and 297 different test flights in the certification. And I recently heard, since the grounding, another 100,000 hours have been put into the examination of the flight control automation and the certification therein. So, we are committed to examining. It's already the most intense and robust examination of an aircraft we've ever accomplished, but we won't let the 737 MAX fly again until we're absolutely certain of its safety.
First of all, I would hope you wouldn't, because there seems to be too many questions out there that have not been answered appropriately. But I also wonder, when you talk about young people, what are you doing about it?
What are we doing about?
Yeah, what are you doing about it to try and encourage young people to enter this very technical field?
Last year, we had a workforce summit we held at National Airport. Secretary Chow was there, and Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson. We work very closely with the Air Force. We try not to compete for resources either at the FAA or the pilot profession writ large. But one of the things, for instance, Air Force Junior ROTC came to us because they want to do a program where they capture young people between their sophomore and junior year in high school. In partnership with certain universities, they want to take these kids and put them through a summer program where they come in not knowing anything and come out with a private pilot's license. But they needed help from us on a certification basis. There's too many stories to describe to you now, ma'am, but we are engaged with the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association on the programs they're putting in place to attract young people into the profession. Women in aviation, we've met numerous times, and they're very interested. Women are woefully underrepresented in the industry. So we're looking at programs both to incentivize young people to enter the profession and then to keep them there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our panel here today. I know enough about this process to be dangerous, I guess. I have a couple of questions regarding the European Aviation Safety Program, and I believe the technical acronym is EASA. Is that correct? There have been a lot of questions in this entire episode regarding the use of the delegation that the FAA uses in its certification process. Can you help me understand what the difference is between what we do here and the process used by EASA, if that is a clear enough question?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. It is clear, and it is something that probably needs to be explained because it's a bit complex. And the difference between ODA in the U.S. and what they call is DOA or DAO over in Europe in EASA, there are some significant differences, but fundamentally it's the same thing, which is using the expertise that resides uniquely in the company that makes the aircraft. Using that expertise without letting go of your oversight. That is what we have been honing for decades. There have been over 130 refinements to the delegation process. EASA is relatively new to it, but they have embraced it. They're much much smaller than the FAA, so they have to avail themselves of delegation. But if I could let Earl, the expert here on this, to maybe explain the nuance, Earl.
Yeah, and Mr. Lawrence, as you do that, you say, Mr. Elwell, that there have been like 100 refinements to that particular process. Were those inspired or executed as a result of what was determined to be some shortcoming in the process? Were they technical? Were they, what would cause the process to undergo a refinement, as you call it, 100 times? And I assume we're talking over a number of years.
Yes, sir, we are. Those kinds of refinements could be generated internally by recommendations within our own experts and our own inspectors. Some of the refinements actually were statutory. They came forward in legislation. We are constantly refining to do it better, to have a better linkage between the manufacturer designing and producing the aircraft and the entity that oversees and regulates it.
I'm going to run out of time here in a minute, so I want to give Mr. Lawrence an opportunity to make an expert out of Mario Diaz-Balart, because I'm a lost cause.
Thank you, sir. Fundamentally, the European system for design and production, their laws and regulations are different. And what they do in Europe is recognize an organization. That's the organizational design approval. So instead of delegating, they actually recognize an organization such as Airbus as having design authority in of itself, okay? And that is what's different. That is retained in the U.S. So in the U.S., the determination rests with the FAA administrator, and that's where the legal authority is retained. And it's not to say that both systems don't have the proper oversight, and they do, but that's the fundamental legal differences. So when you hear the Europeans say they don't delegate, that's because the organization, you have to become a design organization before you can even start a process or be involved in the design of an aircraft. And so they approve an organization to do the work, and that organization does the work.
As I understand it, the executive director of EASA recently said his agency wouldn't accept the FAA certification of the flight control softwares for the updates to the 737 MAX. What's that impact?
Well, sir, I think that might have been taken out of context. As I said, I was in Montreal a couple days ago, and I talked to Patrick Key personally. He is the head of EASA. And Patrick, just like the other states of design, Canada and Brazil and ourselves, is committed to remaining linked through transparency, collaboration. We meet and we talk with them all the time. The characterization that some press reports have made that there's a rift, a split, a going their own way kind of thing in international is not what we're experiencing. And Patrick reaffirmed in front of roughly 40 to 50 civil aviation authorities worldwide that while simultaneous ungrounding, when or if that happens, is desired, it's not obligatory. And just by nature of the process, the countries will be several days or what have you off. Even if they're in complete agreement with everything we've done, they have different protocols, different regulatory procedures that they have to go through before they unground. So we, to the contrary of what's been reported, we are probably never been closer with our colleagues internationally because it is such an important thing we're doing. And we have to get it right, and we have to get it right globally.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm out of time.
Ms. Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses, and thank you to the families that have joined us. We share in your grief and in the quest for looking for answers. Recently, Mr. Lawrence, you shared with this subcommittee that immediately after the Lion Air accident, the FAA analyzed flight data and found 0 incidents of the Boeing 737 MAX trim system runaway, one of the causes attributed to the crash. And it's my understanding that there are a number of self-reporting incident systems that pilots and the FAA have access to. These are databases with a mix of proprietary data and public information, but they're a critical predictive tool to help the FAA identify risks before we have an incident or a tragic accident. I am concerned that there is not one centralized database. This data is housed within the FAA, within NASA, and then there's the NTSB. And that's not an exhaustive list. Time is of the essence when we're talking about safety and preventing loss of life. Do you see a benefit for combining this data into one system?
Well, thank you, ma'am, for the question. Certainly, there's a benefit of being able to share information quicker and sharing more information. I think the challenges that we have internationally and domestically is that information comes from various sources that they're not required to share that information, and 2, there's concerns over how that information will be used, legal concerns as one example. So those are the things that we're working for. I think the entire industry, especially through our commercial aviation safety team, or CAST, has been working together with all the industry and the regulators to share as data as freely as we can and work cooperatively to move forward. And trust has been building over many years. And I think that is reflective in our accident record and how much it has improved over the years.
Are there steps that Congress can take to help you with that, to erase some of these barriers to sharing this data?
I'm sure both the FAA and industry would be happy to work with the committee to determine what would be the best steps to assist us in sharing more data and putting it to better use.
And am I safe to assume that you analyzed all these different incident databases before making the determination on whether or not to ground the Boeing 737 MAX?
Yes, ma'am, we did. We examined all of the pilot report databases for incidents. And in North America and Canada and the United States, the 737 MAX, what's called FOCO data, which is, I'm sorry, I don't know what FOQ, you know what that is? The acronym. Basically, it's digital data that streams right off the aircraft. So you were talking about different varying ways of reporting. That's digital data coming right off the aircraft, and there were no either AOA or runway pitch trim anomalies across the fleet in Canada and the U.S. over 50,000 flights. So
that brings up a point, because another one of my concerns is that there does seem to be a gap in some of this data. If we're looking at, I believe the term you use on your accident and incident data system, as of this morning, the freeze date, which is the date an incident was reported, is that correct? Or the date of the incident itself, was December 30th, 2018. So that's a 9-month lag in getting this information through the data system. So maybe there is some information that's streaming, but isn't that a very long time?
So one of the things is that streaming data, that FOCO data, goes to the operator, goes to the airline before it comes to us. So there's a lag there. I can look into it and get back to you, ma'am. I'm a little bit confused by that, and it isn't 9 months. It shouldn't be 9 months. But in answer to your question, we did a very, very thorough examination of all reports, both the digital download that we got from 737 MAX, in North America, and the handwritten notes. Pilots do what's called NASA reports, ASAP reports, if something anomalous happens in a flight, and they describe it at the end of the flight and submit it. We looked at all of those records as well.
Okay, I would appreciate some follow-up on that, because the concern of having the FAA have a 9-month gap between posting and uploading these incidents to the database and the actual date of the incidents. And I know there's time that needs to de-identify and scrub some of this information, but that seems too long for passenger safety. Thank you.
Let me just quickly ask a follow-up. Is it possible that because of some ambiguity about the name, the character of the MCAS system, that some of these incidents were simply not identifiable as pointing to the kind of incidents that in the international crashes were fatal? Is that possible, that there's some ambiguity as to what these pilots were experiencing?
Sorry, I would assume, I won't say it was impossible, but our data, specifically the data pulling from pilot reports, there were 24 reports that had to do one way or another with flight controls, pitch control. As a pilot, I was intensely interested in my role, and I read every single one of them, and none of them were pertained or had anything to do with MCAS or runaway pitch trim. On the FOCO data, on the data streaming side, that is much more granular, and we absolutely know unequivocally that data did not come back on anything on MCAS or runaway pitch trim.
Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here and for our guests. Mr. Elwell, as the FAA examines aviation safety, can you talk to me about the systems that are in place to prevent aircraft manufacturing managers, specifically, who have a task to meet production deadlines, from overlooking or undermining safety concerns? Can you talk through a little bit about that process and what safeguards are in place?
With a manufacturer with whom we have an organization designation authority or authorization, there are a number of requirements and bars that manufacturer has to pass in order to even have an ODA relationship with us. One of those is a familiarity with our manual, ODA manual, and in that manual is extensive instruction and the list of behaviors and prohibition to the very thing you're talking about. There is, again, Earl is the certification expert at the FAA, can get into greater detail, but part of the requirements to become a company with whom we have an ODA relationship is the very thing you're talking about, is A, that it obviously can never be done, and B, if it is done, what the enforcement or what the ramifications will be. But Earl?
Thank you. There's deadline-driven stress exists in all areas, as we know, in all workplaces. And the focus on when it comes to the aircraft companies, not all have DOAs, for example, ODAs, for example. We accept direct reporting to our ACOs, to our engineers. There's an ongoing relationship. And when they hear of something, often there's that informal action by our engineers. If it's a formal action, say it's a whistleblower or something along those lines, those are trigger formal investigations where we send out our inspectors. I have inspectors that do just that. They do quite a bit of it, quite frankly, where they go out and they'll investigate a specific incident, and then we'll take actions on that. When it comes to ODAs specifically, they can effectively lose their delegation because one of the things that they have to do is maintain that. And yes, we have removed a delegation before, and not any of the major companies, but we have taken action and we will take an action because we constantly monitor it.
How many inspectors, this group that you mentioned, that you indicate you have, inspectors that you have that go out in the field as a result of hearing something, how many of those inspectors do you have, and is that an area that you foresee is in a growth side?
Sure. So what we do is they're throughout the United States in local offices where the manufacturing takes place. Forgive me, sir, I don't have the exact number on the top of my tongue right now, but we have several hundred of them. And they
Does every office have a group?
well, these are separate offices, what we call manufacturing inspection offices. And what they do is they are placed where the manufacturing takes place, and they travel around. They will visit a manufacturer based on the risk of the product that they make, but they will see them at least once every 3 years. So if you're making hose, for example, Goodyear line, they may only see them once every 3 years. If you're building something like a fuel pump that goes in a tank, it would be at least every year. But they look at each one and they do risk-based evaluations. If there's problems with their product, they'll increase the amount of inspections that they do. And we never assign them, there's a ratio of the number of companies that they oversee per inspector. And we maintain that ratio, and we hire more inspectors when we have more companies and more products to oversee. So we maintain a ratio for those inspection activities.
It's meant to grow with more.
Yeah, if there's more products and more manufacturers, we increase the number of inspectors to align with that.
Okay. My next question about workforce. Mr. Elwell, you talked about costs associated with hiring new engineers as well. So what's the plan to continue to grow and hire and retain highly skilled engineers? And what are things that we can do? What programmatic and what incentives? What tools do you need to grow on the engineering side?
That's a great question, sir. And I, as I said earlier to the chairman, this committee and appropriations in general have always met our needs, and as was pointed out, surpassed usually what we even ask for, and we've used that to good effect. But what we need is what we're continuing to do, which is outreach into the community and outreach into organizations and working with stakeholders who have as much need for the expertise that we do. We can't compete with industry on the engineering side, and if it was just about money, I think I wouldn't be able to tell you today that we're properly resourced. But we are an agency that is full of people that are committed to the mission, the safety mission, and I think that drives folks more than compensation, and that's kind of how we get them, and that's how we keep them. But that alone isn't going to do it. We have to go after it from all sides.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Lawrence.
I want to thank you, Chairman, for convening this important hearing, and to the family members who are here today, my sincere condolences, and like you, I want answers as well. Following the devastating Boeing crash, it is imperative that the FAA use all of the resources at its disposal to ensure oversight. However, I am very concerned by the Office of Special Counsel's report to the President regarding allegations that numerous FAA aviation safety inspectors, which I will use the acronym ASIs, were not properly accredited to certify pilots or pilot training on procedures and maneuvers. As technology continues to evolve, it's important that all workers are qualified and credentialed to do the work. However, this OSC report appears to contradict that. In one instance, 73% of ASIs had not completed the formal training, and to make the matter worse, the investigation found that these employees were not even qualified to enroll in remedial training classes. Now, this is the report that was given to the President. Deputy Director, does the FAA need more initiatives for the workforce program to ensure that all FAA employees receive the training that they need to do the job? You've said that you can say for a fact you're not fully staffed, but my goodness, what can we expect when even the staff you have is 73% has not even completed the formal training that's required?
Thank you for that question, Ms. Lawrence. As I said at the beginning, we fundamentally disagree with OSC's conclusions. And I would offer to the committee after the hearing at any time to sit down both with the Office of Audit and Evaluation internally, the FAA's Office of Audit and Evaluation that sent the report from which the OSC made its conclusions. I think if we had the ability to go over it in great detail, you would see that their conclusions.
So if it's not 73% that had not completed, what is your number?
So this goes toward the conversation we were having earlier about the confusion in the order. And that is the part that concerns me that we are going to rectify. But within the order of their requirements, there were two statements. One that said one must have a certain level of classroom training to be qualified to be a Gulfstream 7 check airman. Another part in the same order said, but on-the-job training can suffice or supplant the requirement for the classroom training. And what our auditors ascertained is that the OJT had sufficed, and they weren't unqualified. And one of the reasons for that is because we often hire, especially in our pilot force, second or third career people with thousands and thousands of hours of expertise.
Well, I would say I appreciate you disagreeing with it, but what are we supposed to hold as a standard? And the assumption that because a person come to this position with external training, there should be an expectation for everyone that the FAA is putting in these jobs, that they have the training that we want them to have. I have another question. In my district, it's home to the headquarters of Williams International, which focuses on the development, manufacturing, and support of small gas turbine engines. The 2018 FAA reauthorization introduced several certification reforms. This is in 2018, intended to improve the FAA aircraft certification and regulatory process. My question to you, can you describe the FAA's current status, sir, on recruitment and training of the FAA workforce? Even though you don't agree with the report, what is your current status of the recruitment and training, reviewing, and communications of ODA best practices, and your strengthening of the engagement with other international aviation authorities on safety and pilot training.
Mrs. Lawrence, that's, again, that question is the crux of what we're doing. We have roughly half a dozen different investigations, audits, and reports looking at the certification process from the the components on the 737 MAX, all the way to the DOTIG's examination of how we do certification writ large. We anxiously await those findings because it's through that scrutiny, through those
When can we
investigations.
expect the findings?
So the findings are up to actually the bodies doing them. My understanding is the DOTIG gave themselves, I think, a year to 18 months to finish. The technical advisory board that is looking over our shoulder, their recommendations are in, and we have committed to answering all their recommendations in our process to unground, if we unground the 737 MAX. So that's the sort of the gamut from right now to, a year or so in the future. And the other boards and bodies are in between that. But that it's those investigations, it's those reviews and audits that are going to help us understand how we can make improvements as they get us their recommendations.
I know my time is up, but if we get a second round, I would like to follow up on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Elwell, I want to return to the line of questioning Ms. Lowy was pursuing, because I think it was important to understand how this perfect storm, except there were two perfect storms that occurred, and how we trace the responsibility, and what kind of conclusions we make about the kind of changes that need to be made. I mean, these were awful tragedies, and by definition, there was a breakdown in a system that's supposed to protect the traveling public. Now, it was, as I said in my opening statement, there were apparently many facets to this. There was a malfunctioning of the sensors. There was the kicking in of this poorly understood, at least by some operators, this poorly understood MCAT's software system. There was then a failure on the part of pilots to correct for the upward thrust of the aircraft, and they stalled and they crashed. The pilot couldn't or didn't cut off the system. There's some ambiguity, as you said earlier, about whether comparable sequence of events developed with American operators. Maybe not. We know there was at least one comparable incident with an Indonesian aircraft the day before the fatal crash. So there are multiple points at which this could have been avoided, but in the end, the fact that the pilots did not apparently know what kind of corrective action to take is pretty striking, and it does raise questions as to whose responsibility it is to make certain that the way these systems function and the way they might malfunction and the way the corrective action could be taken, whose responsibility is it to make sure that that is crystal clear, and that it is crystal clear in the internet? I mean, this is an international market. Boeing certainly has a worldwide market in these aircraft. The FAA has these international relationships, and there's a sense that, I would think there's a widespread sense that we're not just regulating for the American market and for the American flights, but for international flights that use this equipment. So, whose responsibility is that, and can you assure us that as you review this and as you oversee this, that, that it's going to extend to that kind of situation, that kind of circumstance. These are not, these are going to be planes operating in all over the world, where the pilots, the kind of training of the pilots, the instruction, there may be cultural differences, whatever. What assurance can we have that that justice is being done to the international nature of this challenge?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. We mentioned earlier about the International Civil Aviation Organization. They're meeting today for the next almost 2 weeks in Montreal, and they meet every 3 years. And they meet to ponder and to discuss what their agenda will be for the next 3 years. One of the things that we do in every triennial at the International Civil Aviation Organization is present to our international colleagues what we do, how we view safety, and we propose standards, and we have numerous assemblies. This year, the U.S. has submitted a working paper on automation dependencies, and that working paper will be discussed and will be presented, and it, like all UN agencies, ICAO, they can take a while sometimes, but I agree with you. There is a definite need for us to look at this internationally, to look at the operation of aircraft from an international perspective. It is daunting to think about the different factors that go into a culture or a company or a government, and there's 193 governments that meet in Montreal to discuss these things. But our responsibility, of course, and the limit of our responsibility is our manufacturers, our operators, our national airspace system. But
I'm sorry, but these are aircraft that are operating all over the world.
yes, sir.
And the manufacturer is selling them all over the world, is vouching for these aircraft, for their safety, for their design, it seems, I don't know what kind of role the international bodies might play with regard to augmenting or basically certifying what you certify. I don't know what capacity they have to add to that or to critically scrutinize it, but it appears to me that certainly the manufacturer and also our agency, given your worldwide reach, it appears to me that it ought to be a very central consideration.
Yes, sir.
What it is going to take to operate this plane, this modified aircraft with these newfangled, equipment modifications. What is it going to take to operate that plane safely, not just in the U.S., but around the world, and to give, if the manual is insufficient, if the training is insufficient, if the simulations don't do the job, to critically evaluate that. And I hope that these assessments that are underway are going to get at this.
Sir.
But it seems pretty fundamental to me what kind of responsibility our country assumes and our regulatory agencies assume to the world, to the world market, to the international customers and people who depend on us in the end and who do believe that these aircraft are safe.
Yes, sir. And we have a number of bodies that gather for that exact purpose. But I agree, we can never rest on how we do it, and we have to continue to strive to raise the bar globally. Our Joint Authority Tech Review, 9 different countries are reviewing what we're doing right now. We have the certificate, what is it, Earl, this CMA, the certificate? CMT. We have all of in the 192 countries, there actually are just 4 that have internationally recognized certification, design, and approval, and that's Canada, Brazil, ourselves, and Europe. And we work with those 4 bodies in all of our certification work, but we can always do better. And sir, we look forward to working with your committee, with the entities that provide the recommendations from these studies to make it better. We're committed to it.
Thank you, Mr. Jesbelar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elwell, so again, this FAA, this meeting of the International Civil Aviation Organization, General Assembly, which is, I guess, this week and next week, right, as you've mentioned. And again, that deals with international pilot training centers. Would you walk us through your recommendations? Do you already have that? You know, what you're going to be recommending so far to this organization, to this body?
Yes, sir, and please excuse me, because there are quite a number of working papers, and I have in front of me the recommendations that this paper proposes. And remember that the International Civil Aviation Organization does not have enforcement like any UN body. They provide guidelines. They provide recommended policies and procedures. And our recommendation is that all states evaluate their training requirements, their minimum requirements, if you will. For instance, the ICAO recommended minimum is 200 hours in type. The FAA's minimum, this is in type aircraft flown. So you could be a pilot under ICAO recommended minimums with 200 hours in that airplane. We require 1,500 hours total before you can fly a commercial aircraft. And that's a significant difference. We meet in Montreal, and we meet with ICAO to have those discussions with other civil aviation authorities about our thinking and why we do the things that we do. It is, the paper that we're writing says, as airplanes become more automated, the skills to fly manually degrade. And we've known this since automation has come to the fore. There's no question automation has made aviation much, much safer. But there's always an effect to any new thing you do. And what automation has done has hindered the ability for pilots to manually fly. So one of the recommendations is we implore other civil aviation authorities to embrace the concept of automation dependency and to ameliorate it, either in training programs or through individual country standards. Because at the end of the day, as long as aircraft are piloted, no matter how autonomous an aircraft might be, those skills have still got to be there.
Yeah. Let me change to workforce, and we've had different members have had questions about this, and so you have a workforce of about 1,400 in the aircraft certification service. Do you believe that you have an adequate workforce to have proper oversight of the ODAs, which I said I wasn't, not to use acronym, and I'm using it, but you understand them, so I can use them. I can do it in that way. Do you think that you have enough workforce there?
Yes, sir, we do. We have enough in the certification workforce to handle the ODA's agreements that we have. But as Earl pointed out a few minutes ago, that's a constantly changing landscape, and we welcome the committee's offer for us to re-examine on a non-static basis, to constantly reassess the resources we have, versus compared to the resources that we need. And we promise and commit to stay in that conversation with you to let you know if either through the recommendations that we get as a result of all of these inquiries, if those recommendations show that we are short or we need to add in one area or another, we'll take a good look at it and we'll definitely talk to the committee.
Again, one of the previous conversations, this kind of came up, the fact that FAA has experienced problems recruiting and retraining engineers. You're not the only one, by the way, but obviously, and other technical staff, and potentially even greater rate with software engineers, just because of the marketplace. How quickly, if in fact you had to, how quickly could you hire new technical staff to beef up your oversight capabilities in some of those areas that are highly, those folks are highly sought after, rarer, I guess. And by the way, do you have, in your case, do they have to be American citizens?
Some of the activities that we do at the FAA require citizenship.
Which then limits your pool rather substantially even more. So if you had to, all of a sudden, if some of the recommendations were that you had to staff up on some of these, kind of piggyback on the Chairwoman Lowy's question is, how quickly could you do some of these things?
Yes, sir, that is a challenge, and it would depend on what the recommendation said and how we evaluated the recommendation, whether or not we felt it was too much, too little. I don't foresee in the near term something so drastic that we would not be able to fill the need. But over time, looking at the demographics of engineers coming out of U.S. institutions today, we are concerned, which again is why we're reaching out as young as practicable to get folks interested in our industry and our vocation of aerospace.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to the question of these separate databases. Besides the AIDS database, there is also a ASRS, the Aviation Safety Reporting System. Now, there were a number of complaints in that system submitted by pilots voicing concerns about the 737 MAX. This included mentions of the plane suddenly nosing down and a flight manual that really didn't give adequate information about the MCAS. These complaints were logged beginning October of 2017 through March of 2019, right around the time of the Ethiopian Air crash. Were these complaints reviewed prior to these incidents? And if so, what actions did the FAA take based on them?
Thank you for that question. I referenced earlier there were 24 in the ASRS. And you accurately described one of them, the pitch down on the 737. That particular incident, and as I said, I read them, that particular incident took place when the autopilot was engaged. And as you said, the MCAS, the Maneuver and Characteristic Augmentation System, does not operate except in manual mode. So it's a bit technical, but there were a number of things that allowed us, and we were able to eliminate all 24 ASRS reports as having anything to do with MCAS or what happened in the Lion Air incident, which is when we began pulling all those reports and doing the investigation to see if it was something systemic, and why ultimately we were able to determine that it was not.
So these were all reviewed prior to these two, prior to the Ethiopian Air incident?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
If I could just add, you mentioned the one that mentioned the MCAS system. That was
Yeah.
after we issued an emergency AD, and in fact, in the report, the pilot who was making the report referenced the fact that we had issued an emergency AD, and so that was in between the two accidents. So in that particular case, so it is true there was one that specifically mentioned, but again, it wasn't an actual failure of any system. It was just a concern being lodged that the pilots didn't have sufficient information about the system.
Okay. If I can go back to the aid system for a while, maybe you can help me work through something. When you go to look up incident reports for the Boeing 737 MAX, you can't really find it. If you put in Boeing as the aircraft maker, 737 as the model, then you have to make a selection for the series. There's 100, 400, 800, and 900, but we couldn't find the MAX. Is it listed under a different series? What's the story?
Thank you very much for that question, and I appreciate your focus in this area. It is one of our frustrations. There's so many different ways, and we call it taxonomy, which you can identify an aircraft system, that searches can become very difficult unless you're very familiar with the subject matter. And that is why, for example, in the NASA reports, the ASRS, is that there's full-time NASA staff that do nothing but review all of those. And the ASIA system,
No more.
oh, I'm sorry. Well,
But isn't it strange that 2 years into this, there isn't a classification for this aircraft?
Well, there is. It is, but people put in, it is the 800 and 900, but people enter data their own ways. And so that's always a struggle and tracking everything. And we do search through them. There are mechanisms. There's more and more powerful systems that can search all those various things out. And again, this is where we were asking before, are we refocusing our efforts on having more skills and hiring more people with that skill set to analyze that data? Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like this is just crucial data that we need for safety that can just fall through the cracks. So when you're looking in pilots, as you said, put them under Series 800, some were under 737 next generation. It just seems like we need uniformity in this and the ability to get this information across databases, and we're here to help. We want to make this easier, and we're counting on you for the safety of aviation to help us work through this. Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you. Let me turn to the specifics of the 2020 budget, and then go to a more general kind of observation. The House THUD bill provides, as you know, a $267 million increase for aviation safety. The Senate bill provides a $23 million increase. We've got to work out those differences, hopefully sooner rather than later. The budget request sought a $9 million decrease, the Trump administration's budget request, but that request was prepared before the FAA grounded the MAX. Now, we got to write a budget. Hopefully it's going to be enacted without endless continuing resolutions. At this point, what do you recommend? What parts of the FAA budget should we add emphasis to for 2020? With a larger budget, and there is I think potential support for a larger budget, assuming we know what it buys and what kind of capacity it gives you. What do you want to buy more of? What kind of quality assurance? What kind of expertise? Any calibration you would anticipate, any recalibration at this point that you would anticipate between FAA's in-house capacities and ODA and the ability to oversee the ODA operations. So any guidance you can give us, and of course we'll seek this continually as we actually finalize this, but I wonder what you'd say about it today.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as you know, sir, your mark, and you described your mark in the Senate, and we, the administration, has not had an opportunity yet to come up with an administration position on where we are, where we might be. I would, though, in general, say that while we appreciate and have always appreciated this committee's support of our mission. But what some people don't understand, we have a line of business called the Office of Aviation Safety. But in reality, the FAA is the Office of Aviation Safety. All of our lines of business and staff offices, in one way or another, are committed and connected to safety. We are trying to move at the pace of technological advancement. As I said earlier, it's moving incredibly quickly, which is why we have proposed, the FAA has proposed, and the department is, one of Secretary Chow's priorities is new technology, innovation. We are looking at the FAA to creating an Office of Innovation, whose role will be just what has been discussed here today. the ability to assimilate new technologies and new ideas and get them into the system with greater speed and dexterity than we currently are geared and wired to do.
Well, we do need to work on this and work on it continually. Let me just convey as clearly as I can what our expectations are in terms of our job and the kind of job we need cooperatively to do looking toward 2020. We of course, know that reports will come in and you will draw conclusions from those reports and that this is not a one-time process. But in these next weeks, we expect a justification of your budget request as you may augment it looking forward. We expect at least preliminary conclusions as to the calibration and recalibration that needs to take place between FAA's core capacities and delegated authority. We expect an accounting of the oversight you're going to give to those to whom authority is delegated, and an assurance that that you have assessed that and reassessed it. Just an example from our discussion a few moments ago. I want to know what kind of responsibility Boeing assumed. I assume this was a delegated function, basically. This question of not just installing MCATs, but also describing it in the manual, integrating it into the instruction system for pilots, understanding that these planes are being sold all over the world, they're being operated all over the world. I assume that that Boeing had initial responsibility for making certain, not just the mechanical aspects of this system, but but how it operated, what could go wrong, what pilots all over the world would need to know in order to recognize malfunction and to correct it. I assume that the FAA's responsibility is to oversee that, to scrutinize it. I would expect you to have full awareness of this potential problem. It just seems like such an obvious problem, maybe in retrospect, more so, but clearly it could have and should have been anticipated. I would expect the FAA to have the capacity to deal with this. If you're not doing it directly, then at least scrutinize it with great care and with great attention to worst-case scenarios. I think we want that kind of assurance that that's the kind of thinking and planning and assessing and self-criticism that you're doing as we receive these budgets. It's not just about dollars, and it's not just about the on-paper qualifications your employees may have. We want to be responsive to your needs, of course, and we understand the difficulty of hiring and retaining people that you need. You're competing with industry. We understand that people have to have an extra measure of devotion and dedication. We understand that. We respect it. But we do need to have from you now and ongoing an assessment of what we learned from this and what kind of capacities you intend to make sure we have going forward.
Yes, sir, and I commit to you that you will get that.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, it looks like the central issue in potentially the accident and the grounding of the 737 MAX seems to be the MCAS and also the angle of attack sensor. So let me just throw a couple things that I've heard out there, that we've heard out there. It's heard and read out there, and if you can kind of respond to them. One is that through the certification process, there was little attention given to MCAS as a new feature of the 737 MAX, and that pilots may not have been aware of the new system or the challenges that might arise if that MCAS malfunctioned. If you could kind of address that. And also, the other thing is that the 737 has a single angle of attack sensor, which sets up a single point of failure, where multiple sensors could potentially have created redundancy and reduce the risk. If you could address, because we've heard that a lot, seen that a lot, address those issues, if, to whatever extent you can at this moment.
Thank you for that question, sir. We, to the first part about how much was known. We, in the certification, and I'm speaking to a process that predated my tenure, but the understanding is that we retained MCAS briefly until we were assured, and you may know a little more detail, Earl, about when MCAS was delegated. But we knew what the MCAS was for and why it was put in place, and it was a subsystem of what's called the speed trim system, which had been already certificated with the NG in prior models of the 737. And has been reported, the MCAS was developed to counter an anomaly in the handling characteristics of the 737 MAX that was brought on by wider diameter engines forward in the wing. I have said in past hearings, and I will repeat as a pilot my entire life, when I heard first was reported to me that the MCAS was not described in the flight manual. I didn't agree with that. I believe that the MCAS should have been in the flight manual, should have been known to pilots, particularly because it was, although it was designed to come into play in a very, very thin, rarely used slice of the flight envelope, it operated in manual mode. And as a pilot, when there's something in an airplane that's going to move when you're flying, you want to know about it. You want to know why, and you want to know about it. But again, all of the reviews and the investigations and the audits are looking at those exact questions about how we could have done it better, how we could have seen when it was presented and envisioned malfunctions. And we did do that in flight testing. We put the MCAS through the paces. When you talk about the AOA, I can briefly discuss some of the mitigations now that we've been working on. And Earl, please interrupt. The MCAS now, the new design, the MCAS will look at both AOA veins. As it was originally designed, it looked at the AOA vein that was primary for the flight. And since there's an AOA vein on each side of the airplane, the primary AOA vein would swap. Every other flight, the other AOA vein would be used. And the thinking there is, by swapping on every flight, if there was something wrong with one or the other in the course of a day, you would be able to detect it. But now there's a comparator. And if the AOA veins differ by 5.5 degrees or more, then MCAS can't operate. If MCAS does operate, it will only operate one time. And for it to operate again, the problem would have to be completely resolved to normalcy and then go back into the regime that it's required. Finally, if, and this is an almost inconceivable scenario where MCAS is activated multiple times, it cannot put the stabilizer into a position that the pilot won't have at least 1.5 Gs of elevator control. So these are the things that have been incorporated. We still have a lot of work to do. And I went beyond. I'm sorry, I answered more than you asked, but that's...
No, I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, would I indulge, and if you give me just a few more seconds, just to finalize, and I think it's important, and we talked about it before, but this chairman, and when I chaired it, and this team, and this subcommittee, and by the way, I know I can, on this issue, I can speak for the full committee chairwoman, her issue has always been safety. And by the way, her issue has been safety, whether it's dealing with FAA, whether it's dealing with, train crossings. I mean, that's and so I just want to reemphasize that if there are issues that you think that you need, you're going to find a subcommittee that is exceedingly responsive to you. And I don't think, and I can't speak for all the members, but I think on this issue, just because of knowing the full committee chairwoman's attitude, because I've had to deal with it, and I shouldn't say I have to do, I've dealt with the full committee chairwoman's insistent on issues dealing with safety. I'm sure the chairman has dealt with it. I've dealt with it, and so I just want you to know that if there are issues when we're dealing with safety, this subcommittee always wants to be helpful. And yes, we obviously are going to demand that you justify every taxpayer dollar and cent, but just know that, and I hope you realize that you have folks here who want to be helpful and understand that that issue is that's the most important issue that we deal with, obviously. And so I just wanted to leave with that. I thank you for your service, but I just want to make sure that you understand, and that you understand that we are here to be helpful on a lot of issues, but when it comes to safety in particular. So thank you, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to indulge this additional few seconds.
I thank my friend, and I do think that's a good note on which to conclude this hearing. The hearing, obviously, fundamentally is about safety and the commitment to safety, and we know you share that commitment. We take you at your word on that. We know about the famous triple redundancy standard that you apply, and we, of course, understand why you do that and how important that is. There is a lot of work to do. I think it's work to do within the agency with this committee and in our mutual addressing of these issues. This MAX tragedy, these MAX tragedies indicate a need to scrutinize the certification process very, very carefully, as we've discussed today in various aspects. The whistleblower and Office of Special Counsel matter about the safety inspector and their qualifications. Of course, that needs to be addressed, cleared up, made sure we're dealing with that adequately. There's ongoing audit work on air carrier maintenance programs that suggests some deficiencies with maintenance that need to be addressed. So there are questions about certifications, flight standards, maintenance. All of that underscores the importance of a culture of safety, not just specific measures for specific problems, but a culture of safety that addresses the agency's entire work. And we can't legislate that, nor can you simply order it from the top. There is going to have to be, I believe, a constant renewal of this culture, a nurturing of this culture. And that's a major challenge for you, as well as to us as your partners in appropriating and figuring out how to oversee your agency and help ensure a top performance. So we all want to err on the side of safety, err on the side of more training, not less, err on the side of maybe a quadruple redundancy or whatever it takes to make sure that the safety comes first. So I'd appreciate any observations you have about that. That's really that really is a challenge, I think, that goes beyond any specific measures you might take or tweaks you might make in processes. It's a commitment to constantly renew that commitment to safety as your primary mission.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Diaz-Balart, thank you very much for the opportunity to let us come and talk to you today. And at the beginning of my comments, when I said that we welcome scrutiny, we welcome these reviews, they always make us better. And it always makes us better to sit before you and to talk to you about these things. You've made it crystal clear that you are linked with us on the priority of safety. You've also made it crystal clear that we need to stay in direct contact with you with regard to resource constraints, if we have any, when it comes specifically to safety. I got that message. I will certainly convey that to Administrator Dixon, who, as you know, and you mentioned, took over in August. We, all of us, we come into this because we're dedicated to safety, to aviation safety, and when there's loss of life, it's devastating, but it redoubles our efforts, and we are absolutely committed to making sure that we leave no stone unturned, as it were, to ensure that we're safer tomorrow than we are today.
Thank you very much. Hearing's adjourned.